Masking is a term that is becoming more and more well known, partly due to the increase in later autism diagnosis, the later in life adult people getting diagnosed, and partly because of the unmasking trend that has gone viral on platforms like TikTok, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, etc. And what started out as a mission to increase awareness on this topic has quickly transformed into a narrative of negativity and victimhood. So today, we are calling out that trend because masking isn't martyrdom. Welcome back. According to the National Autistic Society, masking is defined as a, quote, strategy used by some autistic people, consciously or unconsciously, to appear non-autistic in order to blend in and to be more accepted in society. And masking can happen in formal situations such as at school or work, or in an informal situation such as at home, with family, or socializing with friends, end quote. While overall this is a decent definition, I do feel like, especially for people who might be more on the outside of the spectrum, kind of looking into all this, further clarification would probably be helpful. So let's kind of break this down a little bit into kind of more manageable bites. So first, the ability to mask is one that is held almost exclusively by autistics who have lower support needs. And while it is possible for people with higher support needs to mask, most of the time it just really isn't on their radar or on their list of priorities when it comes to kind of ABA and behavioral intervention. So most of the time people with high support needs are going to be focusing on building skills for independence and kind of being able to safely navigate the community and being out in public without being a danger to themselves or to others via like eloping or something like that. So it's less about appearing less autistic and more about being able to just safely exist out in society. Not to mention, typically people who have higher support needs, people with profound autism, just don't care as much about the perception of others, which, side note, is kind of one of my favorite things about this particular population. They are, for the most part, very happy and authentically themselves, regardless of where they are or who they're with. And this is why we see masking most often occurring in adults or adolescents with lower support needs. So for clarity's sake, this is going to be our level 1 and level 2 autistics. And this ability is characterized primarily by the ability to control and adjust self-expression kind of based on real or anticipated reactions of people around them. So in order to mask, somebody has to be able to observe and mimic behaviors. They have to be able to maintain full-time control over their bodies. And they also have to be able to engage in a pretty good amount of self-reflection. And these are all skills that, as far as we currently understand, do exclusively apply to these individuals with lower support needs or the higher functioning individuals. Second, it's kind of important to understand that a lot of the attention surrounding masking and unmasking is kind of a result of the outrage against ABA. And this is fairly recent. I would say more and more people started to kind of catch on to the battle against ABA, so to speak, maybe about 2 or 3 years. This has been kind of heavily circulating. Masking is kind of one of the leading arguments against ABA therapies. A lot of individuals will claim that the primary goal of their ABA therapist was to teach them strictly how to mask in public. And so because, autism is primarily characterized by these behaviors, the working theory behind like the goals of ABA is to kind of work with children one-on-one to help adjust their behavior in such a way where their symptomatic autism traits become kind of less prevalent and noticeable to other people. And there's not a question that there have definitely been some questionable, and I would even go as far as to say dangerous ABA therapy methods implemented in the past, right? So just like any other kind of medical or therapeutic intervention, you're going to have good therapists, you're going to have bad therapists, you're going to have helpful interventions, and you're going to have harmful ones. So I've never been on the receiving end of ABA before, but I have worked pretty closely with several children who received these types of intervention on a daily basis. And because they were profoundly autistic, the instruction that they received had less to do with hiding their autism and more to do with actually teaching life skills, right? So they learned things like sorting their clothes or brushing their teeth or, sitting still at meals, chewing slowly, etc., things like that. Um, so there were taught behavior modifications to their autistic behaviors, but learning these skills kind of fostered greater independence over time, and it allowed them to learn how to better control their bodies so that they could participate in school and go on field trips and just have more independence outside the home overall. So this is the type of behavioral intervention, ABA, that I witnessed working with these children. And I'm sure it looks different with somebody who might be on the higher functioning end of the spectrum. I just haven't really ever directly witnessed that process. So I don't feel super comfortable speaking as to whether or not it's objectively good or bad for those with lower support needs. But what I can say is I don't really see the reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So just because some ABA therapists might focus more on, teaching masking and teaching children not to engage in autism behaviors doesn't mean that the therapy as a whole is totally invaluable. So I think the success or failure of ABA really just depends more on the person and the therapist and what the goals are. So to just make a blanket statement that, ABA is bad because it teaches masking seems to be a little bit extreme. So this kind of conversation behind scrapping ABA because it incorporates masking is a prime example of how this particular skill has become more and more demonized in recent years. From an autistic point of view, according to the National Autistic Society, or the NAS, masking takes place to avoid stigma, right? To blend in or to pass in a neurotypical world, to meet social expectations, maybe to improve employment opportunities or to keep jobs. Honestly, the list goes on and on. So essentially, it's people with autism who have to work extra hard to formulate their behavior in a way that is socially acceptable. That's the essence of masking. And it's the point, I think, that has been the driving factor behind this unmasking movement as well, right? So more and more people are receiving an ASD diagnosis later in life, and they're receiving this narrative that masking is something negative, so negative to the point that major advocacy groups are actually going so far as to say, autistics who mask are more prone to suicide, which, whoa, that is a major accusation with very little scientific evidence to back it up. But, it's extremely negative spin on something that is sometimes necessary. Another article by Neurodivergent Insights explained masking as a complex process of repression that involves the balance between expressing one's true self and conforming to societal expectations. They go on to explain that while masking may provide a temporary sense of safety and acceptance in social settings, it can also take a toll on authenticity. They describe masking as a form of self-betrayal and explain that it is only by acknowledging and understanding the role of repression in masking autism can people take crucial steps in embracing their true identities and rebuilding self-trust. So the narrative that's emerging is masking is bad. If you engage in masking, you're denying your true self and you can't trust yourself, which is really just an unfortunate perspective to have on something like this particular topic. To portray masking as a form of self-betrayal is just wild, again, because this balance between expressing your true self and conforming to societal expectations is a line that probably every single person on this planet has to walk every day. The National Institute of Health even did a study on this and found that actually both autistic and non-autistic people find masking to be very complicated, right? It can be exhausting and it can sometimes be a source of unhappiness. But all in all, they found that masking is not unique to autism. Yes, it can be more challenging due to the more extreme sensory sensitivities and tendency for overwhelm. So that's not in question. But asking adults to mask in public is not an unreasonable requirement. If we would like to participate normally in society, we do kind of have to adjust our behavior accordingly. So no, you are not automatically a victim for having to adhere to the same codes of conduct as everybody else. Furthermore, alongside this anti-masking movement, there seems to be a rising theme of people pursuing this diagnosis of autism in the hopes of actually being able to hide behind it from a social standpoint. I was watching an interview the other day featuring a man who looked to be a millennial talking about how he was pursuing an ASD diagnosis. And the interviewer asked him if he was afraid of being diagnosed with ASD. And this man looked at her and he replied, and I quote, "Well, I'm more afraid that I don't have ASD because if I don't have ASD, then I might just be a guy with no impulse control and I might possibly just be an." He then proceeded to talk about how if he gets the diagnosis, then he could explain to people that he has ASD and him being crass and abrasive is just who he is when he's not masking. So he's implying that he would continue if he received a diagnosis, which, again, not an ideal perspective, right? So you don't never want to necessarily use a diagnosis as a reason to behave that way. And I'm not saying that, all people who pursue a diagnosis later in life have his same mindset, but the fact that he was sharing that mindset on a fairly well-watched platform and being applauded for it was a little bit of a red flag to me. And, to just keep talking about it, the masking idea itself has no scientific basis. It seems to be primarily a social contagion. And they have done studies on masking, but they haven't really been able to pinpoint exactly what specifically this burnout is caused. And they have not been able to pinpoint that this burnout is unique to autism, right? It's just the same kind of social exhaustion that everybody undergoes when they've been in a situation that's not ideal for them for a long period of time, especially if you're more prone to social anxiety or being introverted. You're going to experience very, very similar burnout to an autistic who is having to mask in a social setting. So hearing things like this, my mind kind of automatically goes to now the next generation, these children and teens with low support needs, who have high functioning autism, who are just now learning to navigate their diagnosis. And what a terrible example we're setting for them right now, because these children are being bombarded with messages that, masking is bad. It's denying your true sense of self. Your diagnosis is an excuse to behave how you want. You're a victim of your autism. And it's like, no, absolutely not, right? Receiving an ASD diagnosis should be a tool that people can use to better understand themselves and how their brain uniquely processes the world, right? It's not a ticket out of accountability. And I think every single person on this green earth has got to learn to some extent to mask and to manage their behavior in order to be able to exist happily in society. Who you are at home is probably not who you are at work or at the bar or at a restaurant, and that's okay. It's appropriate. Each culture has its own set of social rules and expectations, and if we want to be out in our culture or in society, we have to adjust our behavior accordingly. And I'm not denying that people with ASD do probably have to work a lot harder to adhere to these social expectations. And I understand that for many of them, they have got to just spend hours memorizing scripts for interactions and spending time learning to identify different facial expressions and to understand emotions, right? People with autism, they have to work to regulate their bodies in subtle ways and maintain control while holding conversations or working a job or paying attention to a school lecture. So yes, I absolutely understand that masking can be hard. And I'm not trying to minimize that. But hard doesn't automatically equal wrong. For those who choose not to mask, these people are going to have to learn to accept that there is going to be curiosity about their behavior. It's just psychology. People are going to notice behavior that is seemingly out of the ordinary. It is hardwired to who we are as human beings. And this dates way back to the times of the Neanderthal man, okay? We're going to notice if a person is acting in a way that is considered socially abnormal, because this was originally a survival instinct of ours. And now it's just an instinct. It's unfair to expect people to completely ignore non-typical behavior. So, do you have a right to unmask in public? Absolutely. But the same grace that you expect to receive as a neurodivergent navigating a neurotypical world is the same grace that you also kind of have to learn to extend to others. We're all just trying our best here. And all this to say, just like with any illness or disability, people can either use their diagnosis and, their ability to mask or not as a reason to be miserable, or they can use it as motivation, as an opportunity to learn how to be comfortable in your own skin without the approval and validation of every single person that you interact with. We live in a country where you have the rights and the freedoms to express yourself pretty much any way that you want. Self-expression does not have to be universally approved. And I think that is truly what this boils down to. If someone chooses to mask for the sake of work or school or easier social interactions and they feel most comfortable operating in society this way, then that is their decision. If someone chooses to unmask and maybe risk a bit of curious attention for the sake of freedom of personal expression, that is their decision. It's nobody's business, and neither choice is more correct than the other. That's the biggest takeaway. The only person who gets to decide how you interact with the world is you. So rise to meet the challenges. Learn from occasional consequences of your behavior. Use your diagnosis as a tool. And most importantly, try to extend the same amount of understanding and patience and grace toward others as you would want to be given to yourself.